Hello and welcome to Roll for Topic, a roundtable discussion about topics related to running role-playing games. I'm Chris Salzman.
And I'm Andy Rowe.
Andy, it snowed approximately like 5 inches or so this morning.
Did it? Okay.
Yes, yeah. So I don't know what you got over on your side of the state. This is the most Michigan conversation to have in the winter time, but
It
yeah,
really is.
yeah, it's dense. It took me like 45 minutes to drop my kid off this morning. For some reason, every year I convince myself that winter is only going to be like a week long this time. And
Yeah.
every year I am just like shocked and dumbfounded come like end of January and February that this is still going on. Like,
Yeah.
why? Yeah.
By early June, you can start to let your guard down
Yeah.
in Michigan, but not probably before then.
Yeah. I know.
I was at a family event a little while ago in the Midwest, and there was a major winter storm that had been predicted to come in
Hmm.
like a couple days in it ahead. And every single conversation I had with any person started and mostly revolved around, so did you see, what do you think about this winter storm that's coming
Yes.
in? Like there's this,
Yep. Yeah.
if you live in the Midwest during the winter, the weather just becomes the single go-to topic you have. So
Yeah. It's like, I mean, if you were in, just to relate it back to tabletop games, if you were in a town and every single conversation the party had with an NPC was like them remarking on the snowstorm coming,
yes.
like your adventuring party would be like, well, clearly there's some sort of blizzard that's going to be set up here, so we got to get prepared. Or they'd be like, just quit it, quit it
Yes.
with the weather talk. But it's like it's very, I don't know. Sometimes life is not well represented in role
Yeah.
playing games. Yeah.
Chris, have you had this experience where we live in the Midwest? We've grown up, more or less with Midwesterners.
Mhm.
Most of the Midwesterners I know will drive through nightmare blizzard conditions,
Mhm.
6 inches of black ice on the road,
Mhm.
etc., like without trouble. They will go out and do that to go get more whatever paper towels from the
Yes.
grocery
Yeah,
store,
it's
right?
always paper towel. Yes, yeah.
But they are absolutely convinced that anyone besides themselves who goes out is risking their life and
Yes.
limb.
Yeah.
Like it's the weirdest, like the
Yes.
toughest weather people in the world who express the greatest like timidity about other people being out in the weather. I don't know.
Yes, it's very true. Yeah, it's like I don't know, like I have these experiences if I'm driving late and you see someone else on the road, you're like, what are you doing out here? It's like, well, what am
Yes.
I doing out here? Yeah. Same thing. But okay, anyway, well that's enough like deep Midwestern talk for
Yeah.
for
Well,
the time
in
being.
in
Yeah.
Midwestern fashion, we have to begin this conversation
Yes,
with
you
a weather
have to. We
discussion.
probably should
So
have had it off air, but
yeah, we probably should have.
yeah. So you recently finished up a book series, and you had posted a little bit of a like I don't know a recap or review of it on Discord, and I wanted to just have you talk about that a little bit more. So it's the is it the Book of the New Sun?
Yeah,
Is that
it
the book
is.
or the series? Yeah.
It's the series. It's by Gene Wolfe. It's a
Hmm.
series called The Book of the New Sun. It consists of four novels, kind of four shortish novels. The total thing probably is in the vicinity of 800 pages.
Hmm.
And this is a well regarded book series in kind of fantasy nerd circles. And so
Hmm.
I first attempted it maybe a decade or so ago. Might have even been in a book group with you, Chris. I'm trying
Okay.
to remember.
Yeah.
And I bounced off of it pretty hard. And I made at least another attempt in the last decade and just didn't make it very far in. But this time I just determined to stick with it. And I'm so glad I did. It's a remarkable work of fantasy literature.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, I mean, I think it needs to be considered like an important work of fantasy, like up there with the greats.
Yes, and I wanted to dig into that statement in particular because that is quite a statement.
It
Uh,
is, and
yeah.
it like I don't know if I enjoyed it
Okay.
exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
So like I have such, and if you're listening and if you've read it, I suspect most people who have read it will kind of know what I mean when I say that like it's difficult and it's sometimes like actively off-putting for
Hmm.
various reasons.
Okay.
Like there's long stretch, the character is kind of unpleasant and he's not any less unpleasant by the time you get to the end of the series.
Hmm.
uh there's long stretches where it's often not really clear what's happening. Like I
Okay.
was just lost, and at first I assumed this is because I just wasn't doing a good enough job of reading it, but I talked to one or two other people that had the exact same experience of like, yeah, I got through that chapter and I couldn't really even tell you what just happened.
Huh.
That sounds like the worst possible way to queue up my recommendation that you read it.
Yes.
But the yeah, so I don't know. I mean, if you had specific questions, feel free to ask.
Hmm.
I would sum it up by saying it feels like an artistic achievement more than it feels like an amazing story, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
The craft of it, the
Hmm.
world building, the use of language, the use of unreliability in the experiences the narrator is reporting to you. Like the craft of it is very good.
Hmm.
At no point was I really swept up in the story of the main character, but the end experience of it was that I had just witnessed something pretty remarkable and unique.
So this reminds me, as you're talking about it, I'm just thinking about Pynchon, right? Like,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
totally.
like his novels are similar for me, where everything that I've read by him, I'm like, this is something really cool is happening here, but like I don't like it. Like I don't like it kind of like one bit.
Yeah.
I think like what Crying of Lot 49, I don't remember the
Yes,
number.
I think so.
Like that one I enjoyed. That one's a shorter one. I
Yeah.
bounced really hard off Gravity's Rainbow, for
Yeah.
example. Like
Yes.
I got like 150 pages in. I'm like, this is a series of like absolutely wild like images, and I don't want to spend any more time
Yeah.
with any of the characters. Yeah, so it kind of sounds like it's similar in that way. I guess like what is the value of, maybe this is a broader question, but I'll ask it more specifically about this. Like, so what is the value of reading this book that it's hard to get through? That makes you say like, oh, this is something that, you know, if you are into fantasy in a serious way, like you should really read this. Like, what's the value that you get out of
That's hard to answer. And it's hard to think of an answer I'll give that will make this sound fun or
it? Hmm.
worthwhile. But
Yeah.
I do want to say, I mean, I'm glad I read it. I would
Yeah.
when I finished it, I wanted to turn back to page one and start again and reread it
Okay.
with the knowledge I had gathered. You know, we talk a lot about world building in kind of fantasy gaming circles and how do you create a good setting? What does a good setting look like?
Hmm.
And the answer to that will vary a lot. And I mean, you have your kind of C.S. Lewis type Narnia settings where the setting has little consistency outside the line of sight of like the main characters, right?
Hmm.
It's like the setting exists to tell stories about these people
Yeah.
specifically. Then you have like kind of your Tolkien's where yeah, you care about the characters, but in some ways Middle Earth feels like the main character. The setting itself feels like the main character of those books as much as
Yes.
any individual character. And I don't know. I don't even know where I'm going with this exactly. I'll just say it is not often that fantasy, swords and sorcery literature really challenges you to figure out what you're seeing and what is going on.
Yeah.
In sci-fi, this I feel like this is a little bit more common in sci-fi. You know, think of William Gibson. You get dropped into Neuromancer or The Peripheral, and like
Hmm.
he does you have to work to figure out what's going on in some of those stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
For sure.
he makes you work for it. And I'm just not used to fantasy literature doing that. You know, I've read, you know, your Robert Jordans and, you know, name a fantasy author I've probably read
Hmm.
one of their, you know, trilogies or something like that. And it's rare that those settings require me to figure them out and interpret them at the same pace that the protagonist is doing it, if that makes sense. Like there's no
Yes.
map at the beginning of Book of the New Sun. There's no like explanation of like the religion or the technology or anything like that. And the main character uses terms that his culture uses to talk about these things that are not the terms that we would use.
Okay.
Like so I don't know, I mean just I'm going to make up a dumb example, but like he wouldn't there's laser pistols in this series, but he doesn't use the word laser pistols. He uses a different word and you don't realize it means laser pistol until a way well past like when it was introduced to you, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so there's this continual process of like of every chapter I was adding something new to my ability to understand the setting.
Hmm.
And that was a lot of work. And I mean, it took me like a year to read these 800 pages. It was a
Yeah.
lot of work, but it was rewarding. That's why I said when I got to the end of the series, I felt like I had accumulated enough knowledge about the setting that I could go back and understand what was happening in those early parts where I had not yet accumulated that knowledge.
That's fascinating because I think a lot of fantasy sort of does a good job, I think, of usually introducing you to 5 or 10 kind of concepts that have a different word in their fantasy setting, right? Like I think
Yeah.
there's a pretty famous XKCD about like the number of made up fantasy words you can have in a novel before I before I quit, right?
Right.
Before I
Yep.
quit reading it. It's like, okay, so magic is called whatever, Madge in this in this scenario. Right. So you have like it's almost like this substitution cipher for a lot of fantasy, but it sounds like this goes a step deeper where it's like it's really more of like a cultural substitution.
Yeah, there is this sense that I don't get from many fantasy novels that this same story could be told from the perspective of a different character in the story and would be a radically different experience.
Hmm.
Unreliable narrators are not, anything unique and remarkable these days, but there is a certain joy in realizing like 500 pages in, like I'm getting weird vibes from this narrator. I I bet I think there's more going on than he is noted. It is not that he's like hiding or lying to me, the reader. It's not that kind of unreliable narrator where there's a big reveal that the narrator has been the murderer the whole time.
Hmm.
That's fun too. But this is more like this kind of unreliable narrator is starting to notice the blind spots that the narrator has and starting to think about, okay, I've just noticed this blind spot. Now I kind of have to think about everything that's happened up to this point with understanding that he has a blind spot in this area.
Okay.
And I mean, all I can just say is it's executed by the author Gene Wolfe very well.
Okay.
So if that sounds, it's like a puzzle to crack. I mean,
Okay.
if you are in the mood for a book that is gonna be a puzzle that you have to work and put together, this is a great one. If you want a beach read, it's definitely not that. So I mean, there's definitely been like years of my life where, well, I told you I bounced off this a couple of times.
Hmm.
There's definitely been times in my life where this is not what I wanted out of my fantasy literature. So
So I'm still rereading Lord of the Rings, and so I'm in Two Towers, and it's like it's the segment where Frodo and Sam have met up with Gollum, right? And they're going through the marshes and stuff, and they just made it to Mordor, right? And like talk about like a very clear method of storytelling, right?
mm,
Like you mentioned, like Middle Earth is sort of the character. At the same time, like you never distrust sort of like Tolkien's grasp on like what's happening and what he's showing you
yeah,
throughout that. Any of the ambiguity is all in sort of the interpretation of the individual characters, but like you sort of know at a higher level exactly what's going on. Yeah,
yes.
so this sounds like a very different experience. That yeah, the Book of
It
the New
is.
Sun.
It's told
Yeah.
in the first person, so it
Okay.
doesn't have that omniscient voice that most fantasy books have.
Yeah.
Um, I don't want to keep beating this.
Hmm.
If you're listening to this and you have read the Book of the New Sun, I have a feeling you're kind of nodding along to some of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Um, and if you haven't, I invite you to read it with like the understanding that like you're going to find the main character to be gross. You're going to
Hmm.
find the story to be like weirdly paced and confusing and stuff like that. And it's just it's like watching a difficult movie. You get to the end and you're glad you've done it. But
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not always fun
There's
in the moment. There were
yeah.
times when I almost put it down.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something said about that challenge of it. I mean, it does. I mean, right? Like this is a gaming podcast. It does make me sort of wonder how you could bring some of those elements into a game that you're running. I mean, I'm sure you
Yes.
have like 1,000 ideas. Like part of it is I don't necessarily know if I want my gaming to be unpleasant in any way,
Yeah.
right? Like I think I'm okay with it being challenging, but I don't know like where that line is between challenging and unpleasant. Exactly. Right. I think it might be so different for every individual at the table that it'd be basically impossible to
Yeah.
to thread that needle. But I don't know. Yeah, is there anything from Book of the New Sun where you're like, oh, this would be a really good thing that you could bring to the table that might add some challenge or ambiguity or even just like a little side puzzle for one of your players?
Those are some good insights, Chris. I have a few disparate thoughts that I don't know if they really rise to the level of like being an insight or point.
Yeah.
But so this made me think about the way in RPGs that we define the worlds that we're adventuring in.
Hmm.
You know, like there's this it's put into contrast a little bit for me the difference between in ye old days you bought a 400 page hardcover book about the Forgotten Realms that like had all of the lore of the Forgotten Realms, and your players travel through the Forgotten Realms and they experience pieces and parts of it. You know, they never read the whole 400 pages. They don't have
Hmm.
total knowledge of it. By contrast, you know, like there's a definite trend in modern games that I love to kind of do sort of what you might call collaborative world building.
Yeah.
And it just made me think, you know, the Book of the New Sun is the ultimate like GM who has a 400-page Word document of background lore about this setting, and he won't let you read it. He will, you know, he will
Yes. Yeah.
only, and you have to figure out what this world is all about through like your interactions with it, right?
Hmm.
A very kind of quote hardcore experience in that respect. It's like the opposite of okay, you come to a town, you know, Jane, tell me what you see when you come through the front gate, you
Yeah.
know. Also a wonderful type of gaming, produces a very different relationship to the setting. And to some
Hmm.
extent, I mean, it kind of the question of does this setting have an independent existence outside of you, the characters, or does it mostly exist to kind of be the backdrop against which your players do something interesting?
That is a good distinction to make, I think. Yeah. And I know like you've been playing long enough to these games to where I think you've sort of seen that evolution happen. Excuse me.
Yeah,
So like where sort of I came into the hobby was I think a bit where like this sort of more collaborative narrative focus, I think is just sort of like the default setting. I
yeah,
would almost say these days, or you would at least at the very least a GM I think these days would know to say up front like no, I have a 400-page Word document ahead of time, right? Like
yeah,
to sort of prep your players for that. You know, if you were starting with a brand new group of like you know like more along the lines of like no, like this is the established setting, like we're not negotiating like this that and the other.
yeah,
Part of me is really compelled by the idea of playing in that sort of setting of like I don't know, like of the GM being like you pick up a strange object and you're like, well, what is the strange object? It's like I don't know, try pushing the button, see what happens,
yeah,
right? Like I'm not just going to tell you everything, you know, or like ask someone else in in the world. You know, I think that's like there's something about that that is really neat, and I think gets at almost I think some of the promise of what like video game role playing is like
hmm,
always sort of dangled in front of players of like yeah this constant like oh you can sort of do whatever you want and you have to figure it all out. Then I think like it's strange, it's like role playing games sort of influence computer games, that and computer games think they're doing something that role playing games are doing but they just never quite actually
yeah.
get there, get there. You know, it's like that's this very like give and take nature there. But yeah, so I don't know, back to like what you were saying though, I mean it is interesting. I mean, would you ever try to write that sort of setting? Was that is that your? I mean, these days, would you ever sit down and write that 400-page lore document?
Well, you know, interesting question. You know, when I was younger, that was my model for how you
Hmm.
GM'd. You had a folder of notes about your setting that were private to you,
Hmm.
and that was the model for the setting. And like you said, I mean, I'm an ancient person, and I've been around long enough to see. I'm sure there's exceptions, but you really don't. You know, you go in the game store, you really do not see 400-page books explaining somebody's home setting the way you
Hmm.
did in like the late 80s or early
Yeah.
90s. We were having a parallel conversation, Chris, recently about I won't name names here, but we were talking about sort of a well-known kind of author and GM who advocates this sort of really harsh, demanding GM style
Hmm.
of you know, throw the players in the deep end of your world, of your scenario, and I don't lift a finger to help them in any way, not mechanically, not content wise, not you know, thematically. And like one, you have the sense that like for people that want that experience of being thrown into the deep end and fighting against the current to piece. I'm mixing all kinds of metaphors here
Yeah.
to to piece together an understanding of what they're doing. I bet those people talk about that campaign for the rest of their lives.
Yes. Yeah.
And I bet that like 98% of people in that campaign like quit the campaign or
Yeah.
just nope out of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And these days, as a grown old person GM, I basically don't, even if I had the inclination, I don't, I don't have the I don't have the time, I don't have the time or space or the benefit of the doubt to do that first one, right? Even
Hmm.
though like I can imagine how awesome it would be. I can imagine how awesome, how amazed my players would be if, after 2 years they get to the end of this like really hard campaign to run, and we all look back and we have a lifelong memory that we've created, right? I don't feel
Yeah.
like I have the bandwidth to, like, I can't take that risk. So I do,
Yeah.
I think I feel lately, and by lately I mean like the last decade or so, like when I think about GMing, I'm thinking about things like, how can this tonight session be a really fun self-contained experience? I guess maybe I'm lamenting a little bit the leeway you have when you're young and you don't have responsibilities and you can game 4 nights a week to embark on these like more demanding experiences that no one who values their time will ever put up with, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. It.
I haven't even touched on like kind of beyond the time. I haven't even touched on the other ways that, like the book of the new sun has content in it that is like upsetting, and
Hmm.
it is only by trusting that the author had something worthwhile to say did I not be like, this character is gross and I don't want to spend any more time in his brain. I'm going to put this down. I
Yeah.
mean, I powered on
Yeah.
because I knew from context and from people telling me, yeah, keep at it. It's worth it. That is very far from the sort of experience I would want or dare to present to my players these days. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Oof, geez, so many. I mean, so I did a, so I did a English major. That was my undergrad education. And just as we're talking, I just keep on thinking about like challenging books that I've read, like books that sort of like stretch you a little bit. I just like I both think that there is value in like capital L literature, and I also think that it is like a bunch of hogwash, and that you should just sort of read whatever you want to
Yeah.
at the same time. It's just like this very complicated, like highbrow versus lowbrow stuff is something I think about constantly. It's like like I don't think anyone should feel bad for enjoying the Super Bowl. At the same time, like I don't enjoy the Super Bowl,
Yeah.
right? It's just like this very complicated sense of like, yes, but like I could watch that, or I could spend 4 hours doing something else, something else with my life. But I'll probably also just watch the Super Bowl because it's like a cultural event too, and it's like you in some ways you can kind of, I think you can take that mentality and sort of, yeah, you can fit it on top of literature, you can fit it on top of gaming as well. It's like there is something about playing games that like stretch you in ways that you did not expect them to stretch you that is so valuable. Like I mean, like the first time that you play, if you've only played D&D, the first time you play sort of like a collaborative narrative world building game, like the first time you play like yeah, like the Quiet Year, for example, like that is like a like third eye opening experience, I think, for a lot of people.
Yes.
It definitely was for me. It's like, oh my goodness, you can have sort of the same amount of fun doing this thing that's drastically different, that's going to like stretch these muscles in a different way, like, and just like mentally give you just like this expansive experience. Do you have to play it? No, like you could also just keep playing D&D,
Yeah.
right? So it's like this, like I mean, partly I think we're talking about like what's the value in like having different human experiences
Yeah.
here. And like I think, like I don't know, like if you are a person that is sort of enraptured by the life of the mind, right, of like of learning new things, I think something like the challenge of like Andy on this podcast saying like, here's a difficult book that you're not going to enjoy but you're going to get something out of, like I mean, I think most of our listeners are probably like intrigued by that, not not turned
Yeah.
off. Like I'm definitely intrigued by it. Like this is not the right time in my life to pick up a book like that, but like maybe in a year or two, like that sounds like a really good time.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then like with gaming in particular, it's like I don't know, like I think back to the stuff that I remember from games is it's all the things like where things go wrong, or there's like a clever reveal, or like you are delighted by something that someone else does at the table. and for me, it's like, any game that can kind of maximize those things, like that's the sort of stuff that I want to be playing. And like, if the way to get to that is with a GM who sits there typing away at night until 2 a.m., coming up with notes and be like, oh my goodness, like Andy's gonna love it. Like when I
Yeah,
do this, that, or other twist. It's like, I mean, that's super cool. Like, and I do wonder, yeah, do we lose something when it's like, if we're playing games where we're constantly sort of looking back to our players and saying like, yeah, like what do you see when you come to the city, rather than being like, you come into the city and like the smell assaults your senses, like you you see in front of you, like, right, you're just like, you're building that world in front of them
yeah.
too. Yeah, I don't know, it's tricky, I think, to find that balance. And like, yeah, part of me want yeah, I think, and this is my last thought and then I'll kind of shut up, is that like, I almost wonder if like treating gaming like not a thing that you were like, I'm only going to play D&D the rest of my life. It's like, right now I'm playing this game, and like next time I might want to try this lore based 400 pages of notes game, and then after that I want to go back and play the Quiet Year 10 times in a row. And like, right, like it's, like, I think treating it less like I am a D&D player and more like I am a player of games, right, like someone who likes to explore kind of the range of what's out there.
You said something like, what do you lose when you take a certain approach? And the answer is you lose something no matter what you choose
Hmm.
to focus on. If you
Yeah.
choose to do your 400 pages of backstory that the players will never learn,
Yeah.
but it informs you lose something. If you choose the, okay, someone tell me what the name of the capital city is, tell
Hmm.
me what you see when you go through the town gate, you lose something with that too. But I
Hmm.
mean, obviously you gain something from each of
Yes.
those,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
when you choose how you approach it, the question is not, is there a perfect RPG experience that I am taking, sacrificing or taking something away by
Mm.
choosing to do it this way? And it's more like, what is the experience that I want? The experience you want is informed by it, like your personal preferences is informed by what your players want. It's informed by how often you'll be able to play, how seriously your players are going to take it. All of those things, none of those things are a good or a bad thing. They're just variables go that you know that go into your decision to run the game that you decide to run, right? So
Hmm.
yeah, and whatever you choose, I mean, I always have this like nagging grass is greener on the other side of the fence, no matter what type of game I'm running. There is always a sense of like, man, what if this game had more, spontaneity and player
Hmm.
creativity that I could call on? Or there's always something that I'll feel like that's missing, but that's
Hmm.
that's just how it is. And the right way to approach that is, what am I gaining from the approach I'm taking, or
Yeah.
what can I gain, right?
Yeah.
One
That's
final note on this, I think of reading the Book of the New Sun made me think a lot about the video game Dark Souls and
yeah.
other Soulsborns.
Yes.
Think
Go on.
about, there were some debates, some of them quite dumb, in the video gaming community that, in some ways, I felt were like a particularly clear example of some a more subtle discussions and thoughts that go on in tabletop gaming. Anyway, so like Dark Souls, what you have beaten Dark Souls, you powered, right? You powered through it.
Hmm.
You went in blind, you beat the super hard things, you bashed your head up against it, and you beat it. And like, does that feel good?
Yeah.
it,
Feels
it
great.
feels so good, right?
Yeah.
And there's so much awesomeness comes from your experience of doing that. You can, I mean, I've done it too, and I feel like I have a kinship with you.
Hmm.
We have this shared experience of a difficult thing that we powered through, whatever.
Hmm.
What about a person that gets stuck on the first boss of Dark Souls? It's very easy to do. I was stuck
Hmm.
on the first boss of Dark Souls for like, I, for a really long time, a
Yeah. Yeah.
really long time.
Yeah. Same here.
So what about someone that gets stuck on the first boss and quits? Is it worth it that Dark Souls is uncompromisingly difficult because some people will get to the end of it and have a truly transcendent gaming experience, but whatever, X% of people are going to bounce off of it
Hmm.
without seeing any of that? That's a kind of what I wrestle with sometimes with these questions. Like,
Hmm.
obviously there's value in making something impenetrable, in making people work hard for it.
Yeah.
But the like flip side of that coin is, if it doesn't work, then like no one enjoys no one gets anything out of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, so if you just quit on the first boss, Dark Souls, it's just, you've just wasted your time. You got nothing out of this like artifact that is Dark Souls. So
Hmm.
like people talked about this in the video game community of like, should there be a way to make these games easier? And you have people that have powered through it going, no, the value was in
Hmm.
working through it and not ever having the option of changing the difficulty to easy. And like
Yeah.
I resonate. I understand that perspective. I also
Hmm.
understand the people that are like, well, but it's a difference of that or just not playing and seeing this game at all.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That is a fantastic point. It's yeah, it's like with recommending Dark Souls or recommending Book of the New Sun or recommending, I don't know, like yeah, some impenetrable, RPG. Excuse me, like recommending Ars Magica or whatever, right? Like there is an element of like when you're doing that recommendation, like, yeah, will it connect with that person? Yeah, it's the same thing with the games that you're going to run for your friends, right? It's got to be something they're going to connect with. Like yeah, like you were like just mentioning the idea of like yeah, the 400 pages of notes of lore notes. Like there's for sure friends that I have that I would absolutely never suggest that to, and other friends that would be like, look what we're gonna do, and they'd be like, yes, like hyped up,
Yeah.
hyped up for it, right? And it's yeah, so but yeah, and I don't know if I don't know, and we'll leave it with this kind of like this statement, like I don't know if that sort of challenge should be tailored to be like a universal thing, right? Like I don't know if it should be a universal thing where everyone needs to read Book of the New Sun, everyone needs to read Ulysses, right? Like pick whatever hard thing. Everybody needs to play this, that, or the other campaign. Stuff can be for different people, yeah, which is maybe the thesis of the show.
Yeah.
It comes down to it, but yeah, but we need to wrap up. We have gone 10 minutes longer than we agreed to agreed
Yes.
to before we started, but yeah, this was great. Thank you so much, Andy, for sharing your thoughts on that. I know, like, yeah, even trying to articulate that, like, I can tell it's like kind of hard to articulate like how how and why you should read that. But I think this was a really good conversation that came out of it.
Yeah, well, if you're listening and if you ever had a role playing game that made you work extra hard for it, and
Yeah,
I would love, was it worth it? Was it not worth it? I'd like to hear stories.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Me
Please
too.
reach out to us if you have something along those lines.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. Well, Roll for Topic is part of the Roll for It Media podcasting network. Our sister show, The Splat Book, with John Corey and Kyle Latino, is great. Yeah, I think, see, the past couple episodes that have come out, I think Andy was on. I think Kyle's getting back into the swing of things after some busy stuff. But yeah, go ahead and check them out. I'm really excited. Kyle's Project Monstrous that he did with Cloud Curio is I think that the PDF just dropped for that. So I'm really excited. I've decided to not look at the PDF yet. I'm going to wait for the physical book before I can flip through that because I think it's
Yes.
just absolutely delightful. So yeah, go check that out. I think they just opened pre-orders actually. So if you missed the Kickstarter and you were feeling left out, you can now go order a copy of the book for Monstrous. Just check out the Cloud Curio website.
Yeah.
But
Awesome.
yeah, I think that does about it. It does it for us. So,
Yeah. Can
yeah.
I want to quickly pitch something else.
Oh yeah.
A person who's been on our show a couple times in the past and who has joined me as a guest when I've been a guest on the Splat Book, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
He just recently wrote a really good essay on his website about. It is ostensibly sort of a review of the Delta Green campaign
Oh
Impossible
yeah.
Landscapes,
Yeah.
but it is also kind of a larger discussion about what elements go into running a good campaign that draws on sort of that side of Lovecraft's work. And he talks about
Interesting.
other games that have tackled it, other RPGs and some non-RPGs. And well, I'll put his link in the show notes. But the website's hypomodern.com. So
Yeah.
I go check it out. I really enjoyed reading his latest essay.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I should read that. I've played in a number of Matt's games. He's a very thoughtful GM. Yeah, although I should probably ask you if there's any spoilers for the the Eternal Lies campaign I'm playing in
I
before.
think what spoilers? No, not for Eternal
Okay.
Lies. And what spoilers there are, they're mild and he flags
Okay.
them. So
Cool. Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, I think that does it for us. Yeah. Thanks, Andy. Yeah. Again, I've been Chris Salzman.
I've been Andy Rowe.
Remember, if your player's having fun, you're a great GM.